Just before we break and have some food, we thought it would be nice to bring everybody back together again just for a few minutes and to take a look at something which happened last weekend. Did anybody in the room go to BET this year?
Oh, that's good.
Fantastic. That's good. Really good, isn't it, Mike?
So we can say what we like.
We can, absolutely. Myself and Mike went down to BET at the Excel in London last Friday, thinking we'd come along today and tell you all about what we considered to be the best of BET. So these few slides hopefully represent our view of what was a BET.
Towards the end of our session at BET, we heard this assistant head teacher talking, and he started off by saying, the problem with BET, it's all about selling schools expensive products that they don't really need. And unfortunately, that was our view of BET, that wherever you went, a lot of the stuff was very expensive, and they were trying to sell it to you, whether you wanted it or not. Hence, Del Boy. To me, it was a little bit disappointing that there wasn't a lot of what I'd call really innovative, creative, new stuff around. There were pockets of it, but not lots of it. It was almost as, well, now you're here, I'm sure you want to buy one of these. You know, I can let you have it for $4,000. You want 6? I can do a deal. That sort of thing. Which was, I think, just a little bit disappointing.
And that feeds into the next slide, really. I mean, what I was very surprised about, I mean, I've known that smart boards have been in schools now for circa 6, 7, 8+ years. Most schools have these technologies. And as Steve was saying this morning, some schools make better use of them than others. What I couldn't believe was, as we walked into the main door at BET last week, the first thing we saw was this huge stand that was full of smart boards. And we sort of went, are they really still selling that to us? And as we turned left and sort of walked down the row, we started coming across less smart boards and more of these sorts of things, interactive TVs that you can, very, very touch screen, 60-inch things, very hard wearing so children can punch them and it doesn't do any damage. Similar to the digital nursery table that's on show at the back there. Which really made us sort of come to the conclusion that smart boards really are on their way out. And if you're thinking in your schools of replacing smart boards, maybe there's an opportunity to look at what else you could replace it with. You could argue, if you're looking at something like Neopod, do we need a smart board or TV at all? You probably suggest you do, but in that case, are you replacing it with a smart board or an interactive TV, or is there other solutions that actually suit your school better and suit your learning styles?
And I think also we've demonstrated this morning how powerful something like Apple TV is. I was using it in my workshop so I could control everything from my iPad. We're using it here with this one. And when you think the Apple TV is £99, it's a fairly cheap piece of kit to actually get into schools that you can use with machines like this.
Absolutely.
Need to keep looking here because I don't know what we've got next.
Programming in schools. We've been talking about this certainly in my workshop this morning. And many of you will have heard of Raspberry Pi. Just as a random show of hands, how many people have heard of the Raspberry Pi? How many people are using it in their school? That's interesting, because as we walked around BET, we did not see a single Raspberry Pi. There was
of either sort.
Of either sort, no. But there wasn't. In terms of programming, there wasn't anything in terms of that sort of technology. In terms of Raspberry Pi, there was some other alternatives, though, Mike.
There were, yes. And what we did see, and this was causing quite a crowd around it when we got there, was this gentleman. Because what BET was saying is that, yes, we should be programming, but maybe you should be programming things like this. The trouble is, this robot, which can be programmed and could be programmed by children, will cost you £10,000. That's the downside. A Raspberry Pi will cost you
20 quid.
20 quid.
Yeah. Although you have the components and things around it.
I know there's a group, there's 3 heads here from a group of schools in Warrington that do lots of very creative stuff. And I'm sure that before long that they'll be thinking about getting one of these to share between them. I'll just throw that in for Gary.
Exactly. And
but they are
just
fun.
To show you what this guy can
do.
actually do, here's a quick video. And there'll be sound in 1 second. Oh, maybe there won't be, so we'll talk through it instead. Essentially, this is a robot that has movable arms, tensile arms, and they can pick things up. If it gets knocked over, it can stand itself back up. But that's not the critical thing for me. It actually has facial recognition software built within it. Now, the facial recognition software will actually recognize people that it's introduced to. So if I bring Neo into a room and say, Neo, meet Mike, Neo will say, hi, Mike, how are you? If Mike then responds and says, I'm not feeling very well today, Neo will remember that. And when you meet him 6 weeks later, he will recognize Mike's face and say, hi, Mike, last time we met you weren't feeling very well. Are you feeling better today?
And it's, this bit has sort of intrigued me because it's almost animation. The thing is being programmed through the movement of the arms.
Now that's quite interesting in terms of actually introducing children to programming in schools, I guess. Although you could argue that there's very little programming going on here. You're showing a robot what to do, and the robot knows itself what to do. But still, you can still see where there's a place in terms of developing relationships with children using this sort of technology. And they can actually be programmed. There's programming languages which sit around these that children can use to tell Neo what to do via code from their computer. But the question I guess we'd ask ourselves, is there better, more affordable alternatives within school that can do similar sorts of things?
When you see how this thing is put together, you can understand where the £10,000 goes in terms of microphones
Absolutely.
all over the place, sensors all over the place. And this next bit where in a moment you'll see it gets knocked over and has a sort of a self-righting mechanism. I love the walk. A bit like me in a couple of years' time. I said that before Gary did, because I could see it on the...
Some of us would say they like it now.
Thank you.
Cool. I think, oh, no, here we go. We're going to get knocked over here, aren't we, as he comes out of the lift.
It's a shame we haven't got... The sound is just music, actually. There's not actually much talking. Do you know she didn't even stop to say sorry? Or help him back up again.
But you can imagine actually using this in terms of maybe biology lessons or looking at how the human form works. Because it's so similar to a human body, you can actually start to think about how we as human beings respond, which you can imagine, again, from a child's perspective, is quite powerful. And obviously in terms of developing relationships, they're very interesting. The other alternatives, though, if we move on.
Yeah.
I'm talking about
this.
this.
We saw a lot of these. Lego had one of the biggest stands there, massive, great stand.
And for those of you who've been in my talk this morning, you'll see we've actually got one of these here at ULearn today. This is a Lego Mindstorm. Costs about £200, very, very affordable. And there is a full programming interface kit available with it. If you haven't been in my workshop session, you'll have a look at that this afternoon and see how that can be used. But for £200, to my mind, that is a very visual way of introducing programming into the curriculum, which, in my view, is a lot more powerful than something like Raspberry Pi. The problem I see with Raspberry Pi is that the child types something on a keyboard into a computer, and that information appears on the screen. Now, and you've programmed it, you've done something with it. Maybe you've made into a temperature sensor or something, I don't know. But what's the difference to that from a primary school child than to typing some information into Microsoft Word and seeing the letters appear on the screen, or dragging an icon and moving it? They see that every day. Whereas if you can actually visualize the fact that I have detected a blue ball, and now because the robot has detected the blue ball, it's going to do something with the ball, maybe take it to a specific corner, or pick it up, or throw it somewhere, I don't know. But you can actually very visually start to represent the fact that what you're doing in terms of writing this program is actually interacting with the real world and has a real world application. And I think that's the powerful thing that can be used with Lego Mindstorm.
I think the other thing that Steve was telling me yesterday, that the programming that you would use for this is very similar to the program you'd use for the robot before. So it's not outside the capabilities of children at primary school. But also, if you want to find out more about where this sort of fits into the curriculum and what else there is in terms of control, then Debs is the lady. Is that over here? She's the lady with all the answers. Don't you just love it when you can point to something like that and say, she knows everything? You know.
But over lunchtime, by all means, go and talk to Deb. She's got some B-bots over there. There's the Lego Mindstorm. I'll bring that over lunchtime as well. You can actually start playing with some of these things and actually see how it can link directly back into your school's IT and programming curriculum, which I think is quite key.
Some of the old favourites were there, which you'd expect. People like Too Simple, Mathletics, all the old ones whereby schools are encouraged to buy a contract, buy licenses, and then they have all sorts of software coming through on a regular basis. So they were still there, but I wonder, personally, whether or not their days are numbered, because I've got a feeling that our next slide, which shows you how many apps are being downloaded, 50 million and counting, whether that's the way forward. I was listening to Steve was talking this morning, and he talked about Book Creator. Was it Book Creator?
Yeah, Book Creator.
I immediately, because it's what we do nowadays, I immediately went onto the App Store, saw that it only cost £2.99, so I've downloaded it. I've got it there to play with later on. And that is what I think apps do for us. They give us a lot more flexibility at an affordable price. That's something that is not going to tie us in for a long time. Because I know when I was a head of school, we went into some systems, some software sort of ideas, and you find yourself tied in, and it all sounds great to start with, but after a while, teachers stop using it, or teachers don't feel it's quite as good as it first looked when all the glossy program came through.
I
So
think that's the case in so many of the things that are available. Obviously, we talked about the Too Simple stuff that's there, and there's a lot of tools available that cost a fortune. You get a specific suite of tools for teaching a specific thing in your school. And to my mind, with now close on a billion apps in the App Store, I mean that 500 million figure is out of date already. And, we were only talking about that maybe 4 or 5 months ago. They're estimating 1 billion app downloads a week by the end of this year. 1 billion app downloads a week. I mean, that's mind-boggling in terms of the things you can actually do with this sort of technology in your hand at a very affordable price.
And yet the surprising thing was there weren't many stands at BET where they were specifically talking about apps. We saw that one over in the corner, small stand tucked away, where they had a new app to do with assessment, but we didn't see many others.
Absolutely. The other thing you might be interested in terms of your school is there's a lot of apps on the App Store that are Americanized in terms of the educational experience that they offer. And one of the things that I've been talking to schools about is actually seeing if we can take some of the English curriculum content, the stuff you do in schools every day, and app enabling it, coming up with tools that you would use in your classroom that are also of benefit to schools in your area, schools around the region, schools around the country, and that are related to the English national curriculum. And I think, again, there's huge opportunities for schools to do that and to actually look at generating revenues back into schools by doing that as well, which, again, I think is important going forward.
Lots of workshops, and in all, I think Steve and I probably sat down at about 3, but only stayed for 1, because so many of the workshops sounded great. It's a bit like when you go on a course, you think, oh, this is good, let's go on this, and you sit down, and in 2 cases, we realised after a couple of minutes that while the course title sounded great, basically what it was Microsoft trying to sell us something, or somebody else trying to sell us something. So in the end, we sat down with a guy who was talking about social media, a head teacher talking about social media, and that was a good one.
Absolutely.
But it struck me with the thing that I've been talking about in my workshop this morning, is that courses can sound wonderful. Now at BET, you can sit down, if you don't like, you can get up and walk out again. But today, you're stuck really, especially if you want that iPod at the end of the day, you're stuck here for the day. And it may be that CPD is something that we need to look at freshly, and it might be that social media is the way forward in terms of training and developing our teachers.
Were you mentioning, Mike, something about somebody saying that social media was going to be delivered, or was it going to be a primary way of delivering things via Twitter for CPD?
Twitter, yeah.
I mean, you can see that already, I don't know if anybody sits down and reads Twitter. I know some people are brand new to Twitter today. But, I will quite often get up on a weekend, I'll put Twitter on, and I'll read what's going on. if something's trending, I'll probably look at it. But then if I'm interested in something, maybe I've seen something in the news or it's something related to what I'm doing, I'll actively search for it on Twitter and see who's tweeting about it. And it's amazing the different people you can find out, who are experts in the field, who are just randomly talking. Jez Scott, who did the social media talk, he's on Twitter, and following the event, I've been in regular communication with him over the last week, talking about Twitter, via Twitter, and how he's using social media in his school. And that sort of powerful communication method is quite new, and I think there's huge potential that is yet to be unleashed in terms of how that can be used.
This surprised me, because I think ebooks, Steve was hinting at that this morning, I think ebooks is one of the big things that's going to be coming up in terms of Kindles, Kindle Fire and all the rest of it. There was two stands, I think, two very small stands that were talking about ebooks. If I wanted to look at a Kindle or a Kindle Fire, I couldn't do at the BET. There weren't any, which surprised me. Because I think ebooks are going to be massive in education over the next year, 2 years. And I think it's surprised me that BET were not making more of it. And it would be interesting to see what's happening at BET in 2014, because I certainly think ebooks is a big way forward.
Lots of these things floating around. I'm sure many of you in the room have portable devices now in your schools. You may have iPads, you may have Android devices, but there's this huge problem of how do we store them. I don't think people have really got this right yet, because for me, the critical thing about iPads is that they are portable. They're designed to be taken with the individual to whatever activity that individual is doing. When they were designed, I don't think Apple really thought, oh, well, what if we have hundreds of these in a classroom? Where do we put them? And as we walked around, there were so many of these ugly, horrible boxes that are used for charging the things, for syncing the things. You had things with handles, things without handles, things that... And genuinely, I was actually on the lookout for one of these. I go into schools, and I was looking for a carrying device that I could take with me into schools to take in half a dozen iPads or a dozen iPads. And I just couldn't find something that would do what I wanted it to do. And in honesty, would you really want that stuck in the corner of your classroom? And I'll leave that for you to decide.
Four of them.
Sorry, Gary.
I think the interesting thing is there were lots of these there. So what I think the people at BET were, or some of the exhibitors were thinking, that's the way forward. Teachers will need, schools will need
storage solutions.
Storage that will both power up and sync these things. Because they obviously see in the future more and more schools having more and more tablet devices in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Legally, it'll alert you if one's missing.
Yes. Yeah.
It's important.
Like they are very portable.
Yeah. And I think that takes us on to the next thing. It's the whole business of the devices that are around. We saw quite a few at BET, but not necessarily the full range. But we were having a conversation yesterday. And one of the things that I think is coming through from BET is that the way forward is mobility, it's tablets. And it's about thinking about the cost of these things. Because what it is bringing the whole cost of ICT down in many ways. I've got here Kindle Fire. And it's got to the point now that you could put 30 of those in the hands of a classroom of children. They're about £150 each, be less than that because you don't pay VAT. And you've got to the point where if it broke, you'd probably throw it away and buy a new one. Because they're almost at a stage where they are not worth insuring and so on. And I think therefore what schools are going to have to start looking at is these things are available, they're at a reasonable price, the real cost, and I think Steve was hinting at this morning, the real cost is in the connectivity, making sure that you can get onto these things. And even more important than that is the whole CPD, a whole training of teachers. And I think that was another thing that was coming through. Tablets are definitely the way forward.
Completely.
But there are implications that go with that.
In terms of collaborative activity, there's huge amounts of things out there now. We've obviously mentioned a number of times the digital nursery table at the back there. The idea of having sort of stand-up whiteboards or stand-up touchscreen devices that you can collaborate around was certainly very present at BET, I would say. There was an awful lot of stands that had this sort of technology there. I think things have moved on quite rapidly over the last few years. I don't know if anybody around here has a Plasma in school. Anyone heard of that? It's a projector that you have mounted to the ceiling, and it projects an image onto the floor, and you can tap around and interact with the floor. And that's good, and it's, you know, it's nice, but it's very static in one place. Whereas the nice thing about some of these collaboration tools is they can be moved around the school, put into different rooms, and used in different ways. And again, as the software develops and more apps become available for them, I think they'll become more prevalent in our education system.
Because I think the interesting thing here is that for these, like the one at the back, they're aimed at very young children, and it's intuitive with them. I've got a nephew who is 3, who quite happily sits on his iPad and does that. Now when he goes into school, he'll go up to, I'm guessing they're going to have a fairly bog standard computer in school, and he's going to be doing that to the screen thinking, bloody thing's not working. I was talking to the gentleman at the back with the digital table.
Ian,
Sorry, mind's going, because I'm getting hungry. That's what it is. And he was saying that he knows of a 3-year-old who opened a book and did that and wondered why nothing was happening. Well, we're not far away when, you know, that's what that child will be able to do, is open up a book and be able to do
there was one gentleman in my workshop this morning, Ian, who I think he may have gone, but he was talking about the idea he's...
Nothing to do with your work.
No, he had to go. I knew he was leaving. But he was talking around... he's a chair of governors in the school, and the idea of actually maybe replacing the library with essentially iBooks or books available on these sorts of devices. I guess the logic is that in a school library, you can never have the volume of books and volume of information that you can actually access via a portable device. And I thought that was quite interesting in terms of where their thinking's going.
I think the other thing too is actually publishing onto
Absolutely.
iBooks. Publishing onto Kindle is easy. You know, for children to actually see their work published onto a Kindle, published onto iBooks, it's not difficult nowadays. Not difficult at all. Sorry.
So where does that leave us? I guess, you know, when we were sort of evaluating our experience at BET, some of these words maybe came to mind. We were a little bit disorientated, confused, befuddled in terms of what BET was actually doing for us. And we found ourselves questioning, would we go back and what it actually offered to schools as an exhibition? It was a very good day. I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say I found anything particularly innovative though, Mike.
No, there was nothing there that sort of, apart from maybe that robot, that made you think, wow, this is the way forward. And it might just be that we're at a plateau and that things will move on. But certainly I'd think twice about going to BET next year, unless I knew particularly what was happening.
Absolutely.
And as none of you went this year, you might be thinking the same thing. You know, maybe
and hopefully our talk today, our sort of brief 20 minutes or so there, is giving you a little bit of an overview of the sort of things that were down there. And if there's anything that, you know, maybe we have talked about that you want to know a little bit more about in terms of what we saw down at BET, I'm sure both myself and Mike are very happy to have that conversation with you over lunch and sort of see where we go.